I'm Logan Crawford, and welcome to a special edition of the Spotlight Network, Election Day 2022. Who will control the United States Senate? We are joined by America's preeminent political prognosticator himself, Rich Rubino, author of the book, The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids. Rich, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
My pleasure, Logan.
What is the big race in the Senate, in your opinion, tonight?
I think there are a couple. The one I'm watching, I think obviously ground zero is probably Pennsylvania. John Fetterman, the Democrat, and the Republican being Dr. Oz. I think that in both cases, both parties probably got their weakest possible candidate. In the Democrat side, Connor Lamb, kind of a moderate, kind of blue collar type Democrat, former veteran, ran for the nomination, did not win it. John Fetterman, who's probably seen as a little too left for Pennsylvania. Remember, he supported Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton in 2016. And in that primary, Hillary Clinton absolutely wiped out Bernie Sanders in the state of Pennsylvania. On the Republican side, Dr. Oz, I think, is probably, you could make the other argument, perhaps too conservative for Pennsylvania. He's someone who's more of a kind of a MAGA Republican. I think the Pennsylvania Republican establishment wishes that there was another candidate. But that being said, they're the two nominees, and we have no idea essentially what is going to happen. But the fact that Joe Biden and Barack Obama made a joint appearance, this is both of them together in Pennsylvania, shows how critical the Democrats think this state is.
Exactly. Although Obama came out in 2016 with a huge rally in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia on the eve of the election, or might have been election day itself. I don't recall it precisely. And it did no good in 2016. I mean, let's face it, this political climate right now, Rich, is crazy. I mean, you've got sky high gas prices, sky high food prices, skyrocketing crime. I mean, what's going right in America that people would actually vote for a Democrat?
Well, I think that this is what the case that Joe Biden would make. Well, for one thing, he would certainly talk about the job growth during his administration, but he would also talk about. I think he would say that there are a lot of kind of there are a lot of variables that were beyond his control. Certainly, what happened with Vladimir Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, for example. He would also say that the economy is starting to come under control. That certainly, when you're raising interest rates, there's going to be some pain in terms of economically. When certainly what Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve is doing. But he would say almost like what Reagan said back in 1982. In 1982, the country was in a recession. Paul Volcker, who was actually appointed by Carter, started to raise interest rates, and Reagan said, "Give my program a chance." By 1984, after 1982, the party lost 26 seats in the House of Representatives. By 1984, he got more popular, and he actually won 49 states. Bill Clinton, 1992, comes in. Bill Clinton loses 54 seats in that midterm election, and many Americans were upset with the direction of the economy. They thought that it had not grown fast enough. He had raised taxes, but the economy really started to recover. And by 96, he wins with 49% of the vote. So that's probably what I think he would say. But I think this is what I would point to. This is what Joe Biden would point to. He'd point to COVID relief. He'd point to his economic plan. He'd point to the CHIPS Act, and he'd say that we've lowered the price of prescription drugs.
He will say that. He did say that. I don't know if it's going to work. Let's turn now to Arizona. Carrie Lake, I know she's not running for Senate. She's running for governor, but she's an absolute superstar. And she might actually help Blake Masters across the finish line against Mark Kelly. What say you?
I don't know if that's the case. I think the Arizona gubernatorial race right now is pretty much neck and neck. Carrie Lake, obviously a former news anchor, has a lot of name recognition in the state from that. She's somebody who there were some reports that she, I guess, used to be quite liberal. She's moved to the right, and most of the conservatives have pretty much forgiven her for that. The Senate race is interesting. You have Mark Kelly as the Republican. The Libertarian nominee recently dropped out of the race and endorsed Blake Masters, so that he doesn't have to worry about the 1 or 2% being siphoned off. But you do have Mark Kelly. Mark Kelly, kind of somewhat of an establishment Democrat, and part of Blake Masters' plan in there is to link himself somewhat to Kyrsten Sinema, the Democrat who's been kind of independent, the other United States senator, basically saying, I would work with someone like Kyrsten Sinema, I would work with someone like Joe Manchin, but Mark Kelly essentially only works with Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi. So that's basically the strategy there. I don't know what's going to happen to Arizona. Arizona is kind of the quintessential swing state. It's becoming more and more blue. Bill Clinton won it in 1996, and he was the first Democrat to win that state since Harry S. Truman in 1948. but it's becoming more and more blue. It's certainly not. It's not Barry Goldwater's Arizona anymore.
The other problem, of course, that the Democrats are facing, Rich, and it's the same problem they faced in 2016 after 8 years of Obama, is that the blue-collar Democrats do not agree with the liberal social agenda of the Democrats. They don't want girls, men playing on girls' sports teams. They don't want gender-neutral bathrooms. They're against high crime. They do not want, the justice system to be a revolving door where you get arrested, there's no bail, and you're released just to commit another crime. So things are a lot different. The Republicans have shifted left. They're much more populist. So I think it is a difficult race, and it's a difficult race to predict. Let's talk about Georgia. Raphael Warnock versus Herschel Walker. This has been quite a slugfest.
Yes, and this could actually really, if we talk about Pennsylvania being ground zero, this could really be the flagship race, in part because Georgia is the only state in the entire country that requires a candidate to win with 50% of the vote, a majority, meaning that they have a runoff. So essentially, if one candidate gets 49.9% of the vote, they're going to another election in another month. What we saw last time around in both cases in Georgia, remember it was ground zero because everyone was waiting to see who would take control of the Senate. The Democrats won both seats in Georgia, and with Kamala Harris as vice president breaking the tie, and as the Senate president, she's actually paid by the Senate. The Democrats took control of the chamber. This is what could happen. There's a libertarian in that race. So the libertarian gets 2%. See, Raphael Warnock gets 49.7% of the vote. Then we could go on, and we could go until we could go another month essentially until a runoff. And if the Senate is tied, that could be the race that absolutely every national Democrat is going to fly in there, do everything they possibly can. So that's kind of, I guess, from a political analyst, political prognosticator's point of view, that's kind of the dream scenario that everybody focuses on this one race, and that's the only race really in the United States Senate in the country.
It's going to be interesting because it's going to have to be split ticket voting if Warnock is to win, because Brian Kemp is way ahead of Stacey Abrams, who still is claiming that she won the last gubernatorial race. It doesn't look like she's even going to win this gubernatorial race. And the same thing's true in Philadelphia. The Democratic candidate for governor is apparently the shoo-in, if you are to believe the polls. So if Mehmet Oz is to win, they'd have to split the ticket for their vote.
Yeah, and it's also true in Ohio. Well, first of all, so in Georgia, what's happening? Brian Kemp, who kind of took on Donald Trump in terms of the claims that he won the election in 2020. Donald Trump has not been supporting him. He's actually supported a primary opponent, David Perdue, a former senator who lost in the last runoff election. He's the primary. He was absolutely annihilated by Brian Kemp, but Brian Kemp in that showed somewhat independent bona fides. So as a result, there are some, places like Marietta, Georgia, the Atlanta suburbs. There are some kind of moderate voters that are supporting him for governor, but they will not support Herschel Walker for Senate. And this is exactly what's happening in Ohio, by the way. Mike DeWine, the incumbent governor, is very popular. He's got about a 15-point lead in his reelection bid. But in the Senate race, again, the Republicans probably nominated a candidate who has weak appeal to the general populace. He's about tied neck and neck with Tim Ryan. Tim Ryan's a very formidable candidate, probably overperforming in many respects. And remember, Ohio is one of the few states that has a Democratic senator that was reelected in 2018, a very populist in terms of Sherrod Brown, and elected Donald Trump for president in 2020. So they do have somewhat a history of split ticket voting. But I think that Mike DeWine wants to carry over J.D. Vance, and I think his popularity in his mind is going to bring him over by about 1 or 2 points. But that's really a very, very contentious race.
Let's talk about Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson versus Mandela Barnes. You've got an incumbent versus a very appealing, charismatic newcomer.
Yeah, fascinating race. Ron Johnson is probably the most vulnerable Republican incumbent. Wisconsin is a state that's very much a swing state, but it has a very liberal senator on the Democratic side, and Tammy Baldwin. And Ron Johnson, who was kind of elected in kind of an aberration, if you will, back in 2010. This was the Tea Party wave. People didn't think he'd get reelected. Then in 2016, he did. Then he got elected again in 2022. He's very much a supporter or a tribune of Donald Trump. He's probably too conservative for that Democratic state. I think that Mandela Barnes is probably, in many respects, more of a Tammy Baldwin type Democrat. Ron Johnson's basic strategy is to say that Mandela Barnes is out of touch, to try to tether him with Nancy Pelosi, to try to alligate him with Joe Biden, if you will. It's really going to be a fascinating race. The polls have showed that Ron Johnson is coming away with about a 3 or 4 point lead right now. As a result of that, Democrats are putting more money and putting more focus in races where they think they have a better chance to win. Remember, generally speaking, for a political party, the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, Democrat Congressional Campaign Committee, your first priority is to take care of your incumbents. So the Democrats, their first priority is to make sure people like Mike Bennett in Colorado win. Their second priority is to try to knock off other incumbents, and the third priority is usually to try to win open seats. So as a result, I think that has not gotten the focus I think the Democrats thought it would. But this could be another lark where Ron Johnson, who's going under job approval of about 50%, but could very well win by about 2 or 3 points in this race.
What happens if there is a so-called red mirage tonight where the Republicans do fantastic, and then a day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, 4 days later, suddenly ballots appear and they're all blue? What happens to the American electorate then? Do they start distrusting the system? And why can't we decide who wins on election night?
Well, that's where we are right now. We're at a point where half the country is not accepting essentially the election results. In 2016, the country was saying, well, people on the left were essentially saying that Vladimir Putin rigged it for Donald Trump. 2018, you had Stacey Abrams supporters in Georgia saying the same thing about Brian Kemp and the Republicans. 2020, you have Republicans saying that Joe Biden, and you have MAGA Republicans specifically saying that Joe Biden actually lost, that the election was rigged. I don't really know how you necessarily come out of this if people do not trust the integrity of the elections. We're always going to disagree, and we're always going to disagree about a litany of things. I mean, that's human nature, generally speaking. But if you do not accept the result of the elections, and you actually think the elections are going to be rigged, then I don't really know how we come back from that. But that being said, despite the fact that many people believe that, it's unlike economic issues of war and peace. People always say, will this be a civil war? This is not an issue that I think would necessarily galvanize the body politic to go in the streets and protest. The average person is worrying about their own life. And this is kind of more to the average person, I think, they may be angry about it, but this is not something that I think people are necessarily going to be on the streets and going to be die for, other than specific groups. So I don't think we're necessarily going to have a civil war over this, but if you can't trust the integrity of the election, then what happens to the constitutional republic?
Once the election votes are counted, who is going to control the United States Senate, in your opinion?
Well, and this is the dream scenario. I think what's going to happen, I have two possible scenarios. I think that it's going to be essentially tied, and it's going to go to Georgia, and Georgia is going to be the I guess you'd say the bellwether. Georgia is what's going to essentially decide the election, but that's not going to be decided right away. I can also see a scenario where there are going to be some Senate races that are going to be so close we're not going to find out for another week or so, because they're obviously counting the ballots. And another scenario I can see, the state of Utah, where the Democrats have about 7 members and they meet in a phone booth somewhere in Provo. Mike Lee is the incumbent Republican, and he's up for re-election. The Democrats have actually supported Evan McMillan, who's a former Republican, an anti-Trump Republican, as their nominee. So they've supported. They don't even have a nominee. They're supporting the independent. And Evan McMillan says he will not caucus with either party. So why does it matter when you caucus? Well, Angus King is not a Democrat in Maine. Bernie Sanders of Vermont is not a Democrat. But by necessity, they caucus with the Democratic Party, and as a result, they get chairman, they get committee, they get members, they get committee assignments. Bernie Sanders is chairman of the Budget Committee because he caucuses. So if he's not going to caucus with anyone, that means he gets no committee assignments. So we could get to the scenario, if he can somehow wins by a point or two, that each party comes to him, and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer come to him and say, what can we do to get you to caucus with us? Because if you caucus with us, then we're in the majority. You get it. We get the committee you want. Do you want to be in the Appropriations Committee? We'll give you that. Do you want a subcommittee chairmanship? We'll give you that. Do you want a committee chairmanship? We'll give you that. Does Chuck Schumer want to go and rake his lawn every week? We'll give you that. Does Mitch McConnell want to fix his roof, fix his gutters? He'll do that. I can see those are the two scenarios that I find absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it is anybody's guess. I mean, when you have a race like Pennsylvania going on, where you have a man who's clearly brain damaged, where he can't communicate unless he's reading the words off a screen, and he might win. In fact, many polls show him up. Anything can happen, especially with a candidate like Mehmet Oz. He doesn't seem to have any Pennsylvania roots. And something happened to his charisma. When he was a doctor on TV, he was a charismatic guy. As a politician, he seems smarmy. So I've offended both sides here that Fetterman is a mess and has no right to be a United States senator. And then on the Republican side, Mehmet Oz seems like a snake oil salesman because of all the goby berry juice he sold as on his TV show.
I will say this about senators. You had Karl Mundt, who had suffered a stroke in 1969. He served his entire term up until 1973. Didn't even show up to vote. So I mean, the Senate is unlike a governorship. The Senate is something that really you can make out of it as much as you want, but it's also something a lot of candidates use it essentially as a springboard to run for president. So you can be a senator, you can spend 2 years not doing your job, running for president, then coming back and still winning re-election. So it's not necessary. Plus, despite the fact you're getting paid essentially sometimes for doing nothing, you do have a staff, and if you have a constituent issue, they generally go to that. The staff will generally deal with that with you. And if there is a tie vote, then generally those senators will come in and do that. So the job of a senator is essentially what you make of it. But there are plenty of senators who spend a lot of their time out fundraising, running for president, running for re-election, and take essentially 2 years where they're only there by necessity anyway. So.
Only time will tell, as we like to say in the news business. We've been joined by Rich Rubino, who is the author of the book, The Great American Political Challenge, Political Trivia on Steroids. He is America's preeminent political prognosticator. Say that 3 times fast. But we really appreciate your insights today, Rich. Thank you so much for joining us here on Spotlight.
Thank you so much for having me on again, Logan.
My pleasure. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.